Sign whatever you want, old man. The lakehouse closes escrow on Friday. You can't stop it. My son laughed when he said that. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who believes they've already won. I didn't say anything right away. I let the silence sit between us like a third person in the room. Then I said, "You forgot one thing." He waited. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "You forgot who taught you everything you know," I said. Then I hung up. He called back 4 times. I didn't answer once. "My name is Robert Hayes. I turned 68 last March. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, mostly bridges and overpasses across the Pacific Northwest. I built things meant to last. I used to joke that I understood load-bearing better than most men understood their own wives. My wife, Carol, would roll her eyes every time I said it, then smile when she thought I wasn't looking. Carol passed 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand through all of it, and I have not fully let go since. After she died, the lakehouse became everything. We had bought it together in 1994, a cedar-sided cabin on the eastern shore of Lake Chelan in Washington state. 40 feet of private dock, a wood-burning fireplace, 2 old kayaks we never threw away, even after the paddles cracked. Carol used to sit on the porch every morning with her coffee and watch the mist come off the water. After she was gone, I still made the coffee. I still sat in her chair. I told myself I was keeping something alive. Maybe I was just keeping myself from disappearing. My son and his wife came to visit that first summer after Carol died. My son is 41. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is 38. They drove up from Seattle in a car I had never seen before. A black SUV with chrome trim and a price tag that I later learned was north of $70,000. My son told me they'd had a great year. I said I was glad. He said the house was looking a little worn. I said it had character. He said that was a polite word for it. I should have heard something in that conversation. I was too tired from grief to listen properly. Over the following 18 months, my son started calling more often. I was grateful at first. He had never been a particularly attentive son, not out of cruelty, just out of busyness. The kind of busyness that city people use as a substitute for presence. But now he was calling every week, asking how I was feeling, whether the stairs were getting hard, whether the winters were too much for me alone up there. I told him I was fine. I told him the lake was good company. Then in October of last year, I had a small stroke. Nothing catastrophic. My left hand went numb for a few hours. My speech slurred. I sat down on the kitchen floor and waited for it to pass. My neighbor Dale found me when I didn't show up for our Tuesday morning coffee. The ambulance came. The doctors kept me for 5 days. They said I was lucky. They said I needed to slow down, reduce stress, let people help me. My son drove up the day I was discharged. He brought my daughter-in-law. They sat across from me in the hospital room before I was released, and they looked at each other with the specific expression that people use when they have already had a conversation about you and have decided something. My son said he was worried about me living alone. He said the lakehouse was isolated. He said that if something happened again, I might not be as lucky. I said I appreciated the concern. He said he wanted to help manage my affairs while I recovered. Just temporarily. Just to take the stress off. He had found an attorney, a man named Clifford Baum, who specialized in elder care planning. He said Clifford had drawn up a power of attorney document, very standard, very limited, just enough to handle bills and paperwork while I was getting back on my feet. I was 68 years old, and I had just had a stroke, and my son was sitting in front of me looking worried. Carol would have told me to be careful. Carol would have looked at our daughter-in-law's expression and known immediately, but Carol wasn't there. So I signed. I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I signed a document that I believed was limited and temporary. What I signed, as I later learned, was considerably broader than what I was told. The version I signed, and I did not learn this until February, gave my son effective authority over real property transactions. I was not a foolish man. I was a grieving man. There is a difference, though I understand why people confuse the two. I went home. I recovered slowly. By December, I was feeling more like myself. I drove into Chelan for groceries, had lunch with Dale, got my hand strength back on the left side. I started sleeping better. In January, I received a piece of mail that I almost threw away. It was a notice from a title company in Wenatchee that I had never heard of. A preliminary escrow disclosure related to the property at my lakehouse address. I stood in the kitchen and read it 3 times. The purchase price listed was $1.4 million. The seller of record was my name, represented by my son under power of attorney. I sat down at the kitchen table. I put the paper flat in front of me, and I smoothed it with both hands, the way I used to smooth blueprints. I stayed very still for a long time. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, because I think people underestimate it. It wasn't rage, not right away. It was something colder than rage. It was the particular feeling of realizing that someone you raised, someone you fed and clothed and drove to baseball practice and paid college tuition for, and watched get married in a garden you helped plant, had looked at you and decided you were no longer a person. You were an asset. You were something to be liquidated. Carol and I had chosen each other. My son had not chosen to be born to me, and I had not chosen him either, but I had loved him anyway, the way you love something that arrives before you know what love costs. I thought he had loved me back. Maybe he had. Maybe love runs out in people the same way water runs out of a cracked vessel slowly, without drama, until one day you pick it up and it's just dry and empty, and you wonder how long it's been that way. I did not call my son that night. I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia Wren. I have used her for estate planning for 15 years. She is 64 years old, has short silver hair, and has the particular quality of listening that makes you feel your problem is being weighed rather than processed. I told her everything. I read her the escrow notice over the phone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Robert, do not contact your son yet. Do not let him know you've seen this. Can you bring me the original POA document tomorrow morning?" I said yes. I drove to Spokane the next morning. Patricia had already pulled the recorded version of the POA from the county clerk's office. She spread both documents on her desk and compared them side by side without speaking. Then she looked up at me and said, "The signature pages have the same notary stamp, but the body of this document is not the document you signed." I had wondered if I was wrong, if I had misremembered, if grief and the stroke had blurred things. When she said those words, I felt something I did not expect. I felt relief, not because the situation was good. It was not good. It was potentially criminal. I felt relief because I was not losing my mind. I knew what I had signed, and I had signed something different. Patricia explained what had likely happened. The notary page from the document I signed had been detached and reattached to a broader, fraudulently altered document. It is not a common crime, but it is not unheard of in elder financial abuse cases. She said the word fraud plainly, without softening it, the way a good doctor says malignant. She said she needed to contact a real estate attorney in Chelan County immediately and file to halt the escrow transaction. She also said something else. She said, "Robert, this is likely a federal matter. Fraudulent use of a POA for real property transfer involves wire fraud statutes if any of the communications crossed state lines. I'm going to recommend you speak to someone at the FBI field office in Spokane." I sat in her office and I thought about my son driving up from Seattle in that $70,000 car. I thought about my daughter-in-law's expression in the hospital room. I thought about the word temporarily. I said, "Make the calls." What happened over the next 6 weeks I can only describe as the slow, methodical unwinding of something my son and daughter-in-law had apparently been planning for longer than I wanted to imagine. Patricia filed an emergency injunction in Chelan County Superior Court to halt the escrow. The title company, to their credit, cooperated immediately once they saw the court filing. The sale was frozen with 11 days to spare before closing. Meanwhile, an agent from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, a quiet woman named Special Agent Torres, began reviewing the document trail. She was interested in several things: the communications between my son and the attorney he had used to draft the altered POA, the real estate agent's involvement, and the question of where the $1.4 million purchase price was intended to go. The answer to that last question, once the financial records were subpoenaed, was illuminating. My son and my daughter-in-law had already signed a lease on a property in Scottsdale, Arizona. They had put down a deposit on a boat. They had opened a new joint account at a bank they had not previously used. They had been very confident. I want to tell you about the moment my son called me to gloat, because that is when I said what I said at the beginning of this story. It was a Thursday evening, 9 days after Patricia had filed the injunction. My son did not yet know about the injunction. The title company had been instructed not to communicate directly with the seller's representative, that is, my son, while the matter was before the court. So he was still operating under the assumption that everything was proceeding. He called me, I think, because he could not help himself. Because some people, when they believe they have won, need to tell someone. He said the house was closing on Friday. He said I couldn't stop it. He said it like he was reading the last line of a story he had written himself. And I said, "You forgot one thing." He asked what? I said, "You forgot who taught you everything you know." Then I hung up. What he did not know, when he made that call, was that Patricia had already notified the Chelan County Sheriff's Office and coordinated with Agent Torres. What he did not know was that the following morning, when he and my daughter-in-law drove to the title company in Wenatchee, expecting to finalize the transaction, 2 sheriff's deputies and a federal agent would be waiting in the parking lot. I was not there. Patricia had advised me not to be there, and I followed her advice. I was at the lakehouse instead. I made coffee, and I sat on the porch in Carol's chair, and I watched the mist come off the water, the way it always did in February, low and gray and quiet. Dale came over around 9 and we didn't talk much. He knew the general shape of what was happening. He poured his coffee, and we just watched the lake together. My phone rang at 11:17. It was Patricia. She said, "It's done. My son and my daughter-in-law were arrested in the Wenatchee Title Company parking lot. They were each charged with elder financial abuse under Washington state law, forgery of a legal document, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud under federal statute. The federal charges carry a potential sentence of up to 20 years. The attorney my son had used, the man named Clifford Baum, was also taken into custody. He had prepared the altered document. He had known exactly what it was. He had a prior disciplinary action from the Washington State Bar that my son, or perhaps my daughter-in-law, had apparently researched before approaching him. They had found, in other words, an attorney who had already demonstrated he was willing to bend the rules. He would not be bending them again for quite some time. There were people who called me after they heard. Friends, a few distant relatives, a former colleague from my engineering firm. Several of them asked me variations of the same question. How are you doing? Are you okay? I always said yes, because the honest answer was complicated. I was okay. I was also sitting with the knowledge that my son had looked at the years I spent building something for our family, the lakehouse, the savings, the careful planning, all of it, and had seen it purely as an extraction opportunity. That knowledge does not go away. You don't metabolize it and move on. You learn to carry it the way you learn to carry any permanent weight, by adjusting your posture, by finding the center of gravity. What I kept coming back to was not the betrayal of me. Specifically, it was the disregard for what the lakehouse represented. My son had stood in that house at his mother's memorial gathering. He had eaten her food at that table, slept in the room she had painted herself, launched his kayak from that dock the summer he turned 14. The house was not just an asset. It was the physical record of a life his mother and I had built together. He had decided to sell the record. I could not make him understand what that meant. I stopped trying. The escrow was fully voided in late February. The buyers, a couple from Bellevue who had no knowledge of the fraud and were acting in complete good faith, were released from the contract, and their deposit was returned in full. I wrote them a letter apologizing for the disruption. They wrote back. They were kind about it. The lake house is still mine. I had some repairs done in March. New roof on the boathouse. Refinished the porch boards. Replaced the dock cleats that had been rusting since 2019. Dale helped me with the dock work on a Saturday. We worked slowly because there was no reason to rush. The lake was still frozen at the edges. The mountains across the water were still white down to the tree line. I found, in the back of the storage room off the kitchen, the 2 old kayaks. The paddles were cracked, but the hulls were sound. I brought them out and leaned them against the boathouse wall, in the weak March sun. I hadn't touched them in 3 years. I don't know yet if I'll get them repaired, but I brought them out into the light. That felt like the right thing to do. My son and daughter-in-law are currently awaiting trial. I have been told by Patricia and by Agent Torres that the case against them is strong. The document forensics are clear. The financial records are clear. Clifford Baum has already entered into a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors, which means he is providing testimony about the conversations he had with my son and daughter-in-law in the months before the POA was altered. Those conversations were apparently detailed and deliberate. This was not an impulsive act. This was planned. I think about that sometimes. The planning. The phone calls pretending to be concerned. The specific choice of an attorney who had already shown he could be bought. The new bank account. The Scottsdale lease. The boat deposit. They had imagined the whole future already. They had put themselves in it clearly enough to make deposits on it. And somewhere in all of that imagining, there was no version of me. I'd been removed from the picture before the picture was taken. I had a conversation with Agent Torres in early April. A follow-up meeting at her office in Spokane. She is a precise and careful woman, and she asked me questions for about 40 minutes about the timeline of my son's behavior before the stroke. Whether I had noticed any changes in his financial situation, whether my daughter-in-law had ever expressed opinions about my estate. I answered, as accurately as I could. At the end of the meeting, she said something that I have thought about since. She said that elder financial abuse is the fastest growing category of fraud in the country, and that the majority of perpetrators are family members. She said that most victims never report it because they are ashamed, or because they still love the person who did it, or because they cannot afford to navigate the legal system alone. She said that I had done everything right, not because I was clever, but because I moved quickly and I had someone I trusted. I thought about Carol. Carol would have told me to call Patricia the same night I got the escrow notice. Carol would not have sat quietly at the kitchen table smoothing the paper. Carol would have been on the phone before the coffee got cold. I told Agent Torres that I'd had good training. She looked at me, and I think she understood what I meant. There is a thing that happens when you are the age I am, and you have been through what I have been through the engineering career. The marriage, the grief, the stroke, the betrayal, the long, slow process of legal repair. And that thing is a kind of clarity. Not wisdom, exactly. Wisdom implies you've learned something you can pass on cleanly. What I have is closer to calibration. I know now what I am willing to carry and what I am not. I know what belongs to me and what doesn't. I know what the lakehouse costs, not in dollars, but in years and choices and love that cannot be appraised by any title company. I am not interested in my son's regret, if he feels any. I am not interested in reconciliation as a concept if it asks me to diminish what happened. I am interested in the morning coffee on the porch. I am interested in the mist. I am interested in whether the kayak hulls can be made sound again. My neighbor Dale asked me last week if I was going to sell the place eventually, move somewhere easier. I told him I wasn't planning on it. He nodded and said, "Good." Then he said, "Carol would have said the same thing." I said I knew. He poured his coffee and we went back to watching the lake. The trial is set for September. Patricia says, I will likely need to testify. I have no anxiety about that. I spent 31 years preparing structural reports for county engineers and state transportation departments, documents that had to be precise and defensible and clear. I know how to present facts in sequence. I know how to stand in front of people and tell them what I know to be true. My son thought he could do what he did because I was old and grieving and weakened. He forgot something fundamental. The same thing that contractors always forgot when they pushed back against my specifications on bridge projects. They thought the specifications were rigid because I was inflexible. They were rigid because the river doesn't negotiate. The load doesn't adjust. The physics of the thing doesn't care how convenient your timeline is. I built my life with the same care I built those bridges. My son tried to demolish it with a forged signature. He forgot I was the one who taught him what a load-bearing wall was. The mist is coming off the water this morning the way it always does. I made the coffee. I sat in the chair. I watched it lift and thin and disappear into the pale sky. The dock cleats are new. The boathouse roof is solid. The kayaks are leaning against the wall in the light. I finished my coffee. I went inside and rinsed the cup. I had things to do.